Thank you for coming here. Thank you for your time. And hopefully this will be a valuable session. I will talk about some threats in the cloud that we have detected as a company. Not only actually what we do, but basically how crooks, how criminals have learned to exploit the cloud for their malicious operations for multiple purposes that can range from, I don't know, cryptojacking or simply new ways to evade traditional security solutions and so on. I would say that today is pretty easy to find some examples every day. I mean, I just did a test yesterday. I went on Google just to type some breach, simply breach in the cloud, and basically the latest one, quite big, happened no later than 9 days ago. But every day there's something new. There are operations carried out through the cloud. There are high-profile victims. You probably remember that one of the companies, which is the symbol of this digital transformation process, which is Tesla, was compromised more or less 1 year ago. Unfortunately, in that case, the consequences were not so serious, but that's an example of the implications that may occur when, for instance, cloud services are misconfigured and so on. Which are the attacks that can be carried out through cloud resources? We have, for example, malware infection through cloud. We will see a slide after, but we have called this phenomenon the cloud fan-out effect. Basically, what happens is that the synchronization of documents in the cloud may augment the possibility of the malware to spread, to propagate. Cloud resources can be used for storing the malicious payload or storing the command and control. There's a very simple logic behind this that tends to evade the physical firewalls, the physical security, the security technologies, but in the same time, then to evade the human firewall. Because if I see a connection that is going to a service that for me is benign, that I recognize like a Google Drive or can be whatever, as we will see soon, obviously I feel more comfortable that I'm not a victim of a threat. And of course, the next point, using the cloud to hide phishing is similar. We'll see some examples of real-world events that we detected and headed to the news. Of course, application vulnerabilities can be exploited to run attacks, or maybe even not only to run attacks. If you believe that many services like the DNS, for examples, can be managed directly from a cloud service, from an IaaS platform, you can understand even in this case the consequences. Brute forcing weak passwords, and you know, this is becoming quite dramatic because you are probably aware of the dumps that come out on a really weekly basis. The latest one was probably less than 10 days ago, additional 92 million accounts. And obviously, I can simply do credential stuffing attacks or just try to enter. Maybe I leverage, I hope that people are not security savvy, they don't change their passwords, and I can start to scan public facing services. Okay? And unfortunately, the material, there's even too much material with all these breaches. And obviously, the last one is related directly, hunting for publicly accessible IaaS resources like S3 buckets. Again, just go on your favorite search engine and type S3 buckets leak, and you can see you will spoil for the choice, because there are multiple examples on a really, really daily basis. So, as I said before, cloud services are increasingly increasingly used to host the command and controls and to distribute malware. We call this new trend hybrid threats, because basically they use traditional infection vectors like the web or like a phishing email. But at a certain point of the attack stage, they decide to put some elements in the cloud. Basically, the distribution of the payload, for example, or also the command and control. And we will see later the reason why this is done. So malware infects the device via via an traditional initial vector like a drive-by campaign, a phishing email. When the malware is downloaded, it calls various services like websites, cloud storage, etc., and then basically can use the cloud storage also to exfiltrate the information. So basically, you know the kill chain. So recognition, weaponization, delivery of the payload, exploit, and also callback and persist. You know probably that basically the kill chain may vary. The times of the kill chain and the phases of the kill chain may vary depending if the attack is opportunistic or targeted. But it's interesting actually, because we have noticed, not only us, of course, there are multiple examples of attacks carried out using the kill chain modified to cope with the cloud, both opportunistic in nature and targeted. I remember at least 2 examples, very recent examples of targeted attacks exploiting the cloud by an APT called Dark Hydrus, targeting primarily the Middle East, and another IPT called the Cobalt Strike Gang. The guys behind also the Carbanak malware. You are probably aware of the Carbanak malware, so targeting primarily financial organizations. And the cloud can be used, you know, basically the recognition is normally done when the attack is targeted, because I need to collect information about my victims. Normally, the most used channel is social engineering, because unfortunately today you can go on a social network and you can see every single detail of the life of a person, and unfortunately the line between personal and professional life, even on personal social networks, is very blurred. But also, even the cloud can be used, because I have multiple ways to recognize if a specific application if a specific target is using a cloud service, because I can try to guess the domains and see if these domains exist, and then try to use stolen credentials to see if I can enter. Then the delivery, obviously, traditionally has always been using the web or also the email, but today, as we will see, can also use the cloud. The exploit, again, can use the cloud, because actually, yeah, the exploit happens in the endpoint, but there might be multiple stages where multiple stages of the payload are downloaded, and obviously then the callback and persist, the callback phase. Obviously, the persistence phase happens only if the attack is targeted, normally because the attackers want to establish the footprint inside the organization and then use this footprint to do their nasty things. There has been a very remarkable example recently, just a couple of weeks ago, of a company in our sector that was victim of similar attacks. But anyway, the callback, even in this case, can go to a command and control infrastructure hosted on a cloud service. Why is the cloud used for this, for these phases of the kill chain for multiple reasons. First, if I decide to go in an infrastructure like, for example, AWS, it's everywhere. I don't need to explicitly register a domain, so expose an element of the attack chain that can be detected or blacklisted. Most of all, every organization now, directly or indirectly, is using AWS. And so basically, these domains will never be blacklisted. And in the same time, on-prem technologies don't do decryption on a large scale, obviously, because it affects performances, it affects the user experience, and so on. So basically, it's very likely that if a certain organization is using AWS, is using Google Cloud Platform, there will be very lax security controls on the traffic going to these cloud services. So if it's a callback, won't be detected, won't be blacklisted, most of all. And if it's a payload distribution, obviously that connection won't be scanned, because normally traditional firewalls or proxies don't scan these domains because don't have resources for SSL decryption on a large scale, because they introduce latency and so on. Unfortunately, the criminals have quickly understood this reality and obviously are adapting to that. Okay. Once that we have just described how the threat, the kill chain has evolved, or basically how the cloud can play some roles inside the kill chain. Let's see some examples. I've told you before the risks connected to the adoption of the threats connected to the adoption of the cloud. But for example, this was a research that my company did. Basically, back in September 2016, we discovered a malware called Virlux, virus locker, that was characterized by having basically two functions on the heat file. The file was encrypted, obviously, and in the same time was turned into an infector. What happened, we discovered this threat because basically the file infected a cloud application, a cloud storage, and so all the files became infection vectors, and obviously they were synchronized inside the company, and obviously the malware was able to propagate much more quickly. We believed that this was only a theoretical effect. We call this the fan-out effect, but in the same time, a couple of years, 1.5 years after, there was another ransomware using a similar mechanism called QKG that was using, basically, he was propagating himself through basically the document template. So he infected the files, infecting the template, and so all the documents written with the same template were infected as well. And obviously imagine what happens if I'm using Office 365, if my organization is using Office 365, for example, and the documents will be put at disposal of all the members of the organization and synchronized. But this is the first example. We discovered it back in 2016. We believed it was only a theoretical effect, but there are also some examples in the wild using similar techniques to propagate. Just for the records, this is every more or less 6 months, my company publishes a report of the malware that we see, and basically, except for in the cloud, obviously in the cloud. This is the telemetry that we collect from the customer base in the cloud, and normally we see that backdoors and Microsoft Office macros rank at #1. I'm curious to see what will be the outcome in the next report. This one was the latest because we do one every 6 months. This was more or less 1 year ago. The latest one in October was dedicated to the IaaS security, but I think it's nearly time for the 2019 report. So I'm curious to see what will be the outcomes. So this is just to tell you that basically these are, the cloud services are used in the kill chain because they are able to bypass traditional security measures. It's like a Lambo that is able to pass the parking bar, okay? Unfortunately, I didn't find a picture with a real Italian car. I know Lambo is Italian, but just the name, given that it belongs to the VAG group. But anyway, this was a very good example to show you basically how it is possible to evade a security, the traditional security. Let's see some examples, actually. These are examples that we spotted in the wild. Actually, many of them, I was unsure if showing these slides because actually, you know CoinHive. You know what CoinHive is, right? It's a library to mine. It's a library to mine Monero. Many of these examples actually were using CoinHive that has been shut down 2 weeks ago because now the price of the crypto coins is so volatile that actually they said, we don't think that our project is convenient any longer. Anyway,